I've sentenced 342 men to life in prison, but I never understood what life, or prison, truly meant until my heart stopped beating last winter. My name is Marcus, and for 50 years, I walked the halls of the Dirksen Federal Building in Chicago as a federal prosecutor. I was a man of logic, a man of evidence, and a man who believed that justice was something we wrote on paper. I am 95 years old now. My skin is thin like parchment, and my hands shake when I hold a cup of tea, but my mind is sharper than it was the day I argued my first case before the Supreme Court. I am writing this because the verdict I received on the other side of death is the only one that matters, and I need you to hear it before your own trial begins. It happened on a Tuesday in late January. Chicago was locked in the grip of a polar vortex. The wind coming off Lake Michigan was so cold it felt like it could strip the paint off the buildings. I was sitting in my study on the 42nd floor, looking out at the frozen city. The glass of my window was thick, but I could still feel the chill radiating through it. I was alone. My wife had passed 10 years ago, and my children were distant, living lives I had paid for, but never really partook in. I was reviewing my old case files, a habit I had developed in my 90s. I liked to read the transcripts of my victories. It gave me a sense of control, a reminder that I was a man of consequence. I did not believe in the spiritual world. To me, Christian testimonies were stories for the weak-minded, crutches for people who could not handle the cold, hard facts of existence. I had heard people talk about near-death experiences and testimonies of hell, but I categorized them alongside perjury, fabrications of the desperate. I was a man of the law. If I could not see it, measure it, or cross-examine it, it did not exist. I was arrogant. I thought I was the one asking the questions. I did not realize that my entire life was an answer to a question I had ignored. The attack did not come with pain. That is the first thing I want you to understand. We expect death to be violent, but for me, it was a sudden, overwhelming silence. I was reaching for my fountain pen to make a note in the margin of a file from 1968. My hand simply refused to move. It was as if the command from my brain was intercepted. Then the sensation of gravity vanished. The heavy oak chair I was sitting in ceased to support me. I felt a sensation of sliding, not down, but out. I watched my own body slump forward. It was a clinical observation. I saw the coffee cup tip over, spilling a dark stain across the papers I cherished so much. The liquid moved in slow motion, creeping across the legal briefs like a dark tide. I stood up, or I thought I stood up. I looked down at the man in the chair. He looked old, he looked small, he looked like a stranger wearing my clothes. I saw the thinning white hair and the liver spots on the hands. I felt a strange detachment, a total lack of empathy for the corpse. That vessel was done. It was broken evidence. The room began to change. The familiar bookshelves filled with leather-bound legal volumes began to lose their solidity. They became translucent, like smoke held in the shape of books. The expensive Persian rug, the mahogany desk, the awards on the wall, they all faded into a grey mist, but the cold remained. In fact, it intensified. The chill of the Chicago winter was nothing compared to the drop in temperature I felt in my spirit. It was a cold that did not just touch the skin, it bypassed the surface and froze the core of my being. I turned toward the window. The lights of Chicago were gone. The skyline was there, but it was dark, illuminated only by a faint, sickly purple glow that seemed to rise from the streets below. I realized then that I was seeing the city as it truly was. I was seeing the spiritual infrastructure of Chicago. Panic should have set in, but I was still operating on the logic of a prosecutor. I tried to analyze my situation. I told myself this was a hallucination caused by hypoxia. I told myself to breathe, but I had no lungs. I tried to speak, to call 911, but I had no voice box. I was pure consciousness suspended in a freezing void. Then I heard the sound. It was not a voice. It was the sound of a gavel striking a sounding block. It was loud, authoritative, and final. It reverberated through the grey mist, shaking the very atoms of my spirit. It came from everywhere and nowhere. It was a summons. I knew that sound. I had used it myself thousands of times to bring a room to order. But this time, I was not the one holding the gavel. I was the one being called to order. A force, irresistible and magnetic, grabbed me by the chest. It was not a hand, but a pull, like a hook in the center of my soul. I was yanked backward through the walls of my penthouse, out into the freezing night air above the city. I looked down. I expected to see the traffic, the snowplows, the pedestrians. Instead, I saw chains. Massive rusted chains draped over the skyscrapers like holiday garlands. They were wrapped around the John Hancock Center, coiled around the Willis Tower, and they dragged down into the streets, binding the buildings together in a web of iron. And moving along these chains were things that defied description. They were not the horned monsters of medieval paintings. They were efficient, dark shapes, moving with purpose. They looked like administrators. They carried clipboards made of shadow. They were busy. They were working. I was floating above the city I thought I knew, and for the first time I saw that Chicago was not a city of commerce or law. It was a prison yard. And I was about to be processed. The pull on my chest tightened, dragging me away from the only world I understood, pulling me toward a darkness that waited above the clouds like the mouth of a great beast. I tried to scream, "I object!" but the silence swallowed my intent. My trial had begun. The force that had pulled me from my body halted its ascent. I was left suspended in the air, perhaps 1,000 feet above the Loop, the central business district of Chicago. From this vantage point in the physical world, I would have seen the glittering lights of the skyscrapers, the flow of traffic on Lakeshore Drive, and the dark expanse of the lake. But with my dead eyes, I saw a different reality. The city was not made of glass and steel. It was constructed of smoke and bone. I looked down at the financial district, the place where I had spent decades arguing over millions of dollars. I expected to see chaos, but what I saw was a terrifying order. The buildings were covered in a thick, translucent film, like the caul on a newborn. Inside this film, entities moved with precise, jerky motions. They were not organic. They resembled geometric shapes made of black ink, sharp-angled and flat, sliding along the walls of the banks and law firms. These were the spirits of legalism and the demons of technicality. I knew them instantly, though I had never seen them before. I recognized their energy. It was the same cold, calculating energy I had felt in the courtroom when I used a loophole to crush an opponent. These creatures did not have faces. They had surfaces that reflected the greed of the men inside the buildings. They fed on the lies written in contracts. Every time a lawyer drafted a clause intended to deceive, one of these ink creatures would grow larger, absorbing the dishonesty like a sponge absorbing dirty water. I drifted lower, guided by an invisible hand that wanted me to witness the evidence against my own profession. I floated toward a penthouse window of a building I knew well. Inside, 2 men were standing by a fireplace. I recognized them. They were junior partners at a firm I had once mentored. In the physical realm, they were wearing tailored suits, holding crystal tumblers of scotch, celebrating a merger. They looked successful. They looked powerful. But in the spirit, they were naked and emaciated. Their skin was grey and covered in sores. Standing between them was a creature that looked like a serpent, but it was made of copper wire and fiber-optic cables. As the 2 men reached out to shake hands, sealing their deal, the serpent coiled around their forearms. It did not bite them. It fused with them. The wire serpent tightened, binding their wrists together. I watched as the copper threads burrowed into their flesh, traveling up their arms and into their chests. They were smiling at each other, clinking their glasses, completely unaware that they had just sold their freedom. The deal they had made was not just financial, it was a spiritual transaction. They had agreed to compromise their integrity for profit, and the enemy had notarized the document instantly. The serpent pulsed with a dull, rhythmic light, feeding on the future misery this merger would cause to thousands of laid-off workers. I tried to look away, but the scene shifted. I saw the streets below. The people walking on the sidewalks appeared to be wading through waist-deep sludge. This sludge was invisible to them, but it slowed their movements. It was the collective weight of anxiety and debt. I saw a young woman looking at her phone, her face illuminated by the screen. A small, leech-like demon was attached to the back of her neck, with a proboscis inserted into the base of her skull. It was a spirit of distraction. It pumped a grey fluid into her mind, keeping her docile, keeping her scrolling, ensuring she never looked up to see the reality of her condition. The most terrifying part was the familiarity of it all. I realized that for 95 years I had been a bricklayer in this prison. Every time I had prioritized the letter of the law over the spirit of justice, I had added a bar to the cage. I had thought I was a guardian of society, but I had been a majestic figurehead on a sinking ship. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was not just an observer, I was a conspirator. I had spent my life demanding evidence, and now the evidence was all around me, convicting me. The city was a machine designed to extract souls, and I had been one of its operators. The cold deepened, the suspension broke. The upward pull returned, but this time it was violent. The view of the city vanished, sucked away into a pinprick of light that was swallowed by a sudden, overwhelming darkness. I was being moved to the next venue. The discovery phase was over. The trial was about to move to the sentencing. If this story is speaking to you, if something inside your heart is stirring, stay with me and take a moment to subscribe here to the channel. This is not just a video. This is an encounter with God. The darkness did not last. I was deposited into a space that felt aggressively sterile, like an operating theater or a high-tech interrogation room. The walls were white, blindingly so, stretching up into an infinite haze. This was not hell, or at least not the fiery pit I had seen in medieval woodcuts. This was a vision of the world I had just left, but projected forward into its inevitable conclusion. I was standing in the courtroom of the future. As a prosecutor, I lived by the definition of words. Murder had a definition. Fraud had a definition. Truth was a fixed point, a star we navigated by. But here, in this terrifying future, the star had gone out. I watched as the concept of objective truth was dragged before a tribunal and executed. I saw a man standing at a podium. He was an ordinary man, perhaps a teacher or a father. He held a book in his hands, a history book, or perhaps a Bible. He was trying to read from it. He opened his mouth to speak a fact, a simple, verifiable reality. But as the words left his lips, they dissolved. The air itself was hostile to them. The sound waves twisted, changing frequency before they reached the ears of the listeners. He said freedom, but the crowd heard hate. He said family, but the crowd heard oppression. I tried to intervene. I wanted to shout, "Objection! Hearsay! You are twisting his testimony." But I was a ghost in this machine. I watched as the man looked at the book in his hands, confused. The ink on the pages began to run. The letters unhinged themselves and scrambled, rearranging into new sentences that contradicted what he had just read. It was a fluid reality. The past was being rewritten in real time to suit the anger of the mob. The judge sat high above on a dais made of polished chrome. I looked up, expecting to see a magistrate, a figure of authority, but the judge had no face. Where the face should have been, there was a black mirror. It reflected the crowd. The mob was the judge. The loudest scream was the law. There was no deliberation, no jury of peers. There was only the immediate crushing weight of popular consensus. I turned my attention to the jury box. It was not filled with humans. It was a curved wall of glowing screens, thousands of them, stacked like bricks. Each screen played a loop of the defendant's life, but not his whole life. They played only his mistakes, a moment of anger in traffic, a clumsy sentence spoken 10 years ago, a joke that didn't land. These fragments were looped, amplified and distorted until they were the only truth that existed. The digital jury did not blink. It did not forgive. It simply broadcasted guilt at a deafening volume. The atmosphere in this room was suffocating. It was a tyranny of lies. I realized that the legal system I had served for 50 years had been the precursor to this. We had slowly removed God from the courtroom, replacing him with procedure. We had replaced moral absolutes with legal relativism, and this was the result. A world where innocence was no defense, because innocence was defined by whoever held the microphone. The man at the podium fell to his knees. He was not being physically beaten, but he was being dismantled. His identity was being stripped away, replaced by the label the crowd had chosen for him. I felt a surge of nausea. This was the ultimate miscarriage of justice. It was the murder of the soul by the consensus of the soulless. I realized then that without a supreme judge, without God, there is no such thing as justice. There is only power. And in this vision of the future, power belonged to the father of lies. The white walls began to vibrate with a low-frequency hum. The floor beneath the defendant opened up, not into a cell, but into a void of non-existence. He was cancelled in the most literal sense. He was deleted from the memory of the earth. I wanted to weep for him, but the vision shifted again. The sterile white room cracked like an eggshell. The smooth, artificial surfaces shattered, revealing something raw and violent underneath. The intellectual horror of the courtroom was replaced by a visceral, elemental terror. The laws of man had failed. Now, I was about to witness the laws of nature responding to the crimes of humanity. The sterile white walls of the future courtroom did not fade away. They were torn apart by a wind that felt like the breath of an angry god. I was suddenly standing on the shore of Lake Michigan, near the concrete steps where I used to jog as a young man. But this was not the lake I knew. The Chicago winter is famous for its brutality, for ice that forms jagged sheets along the shoreline. What I saw now was impossible. The lake was boiling. It was the dead of winter. The air temperature was far below zero, yet the water was churning violently, releasing great plumes of steam that smelled of sulfur and rot. It was not boiling from heat. It was boiling from rage. The water itself seemed to be in convulsions, rejecting the filth that humanity had poured into it for centuries. I watched as the waves rose up, not driven by the wind, but by a will of their own. They crashed against the concrete barriers of Lakeshore Drive, shattering the stone like brittle sugar. I looked at the city skyline. The skyscrapers were swaying. This was not an earthquake. The ground was not shaking. It was recoiling. I saw a crowd of people running from the loop toward the water, fleeing some unseen terror in the city center. As they ran, the pavement beneath their feet rippled. It moved like the skin of a horse shuddering to dislodge a fly. The earth was refusing to let them walk on it. I watched in horror as a man tried to plant his feet to run, but the asphalt buckled and threw him backward. He tried to crawl, but the soil itself seemed to contract, pulling away from his touch. It was the great recoil. The planet was no longer a passive stage for human drama. It had become a hostile witness. For thousands of years, the earth had swallowed the blood of the innocent, absorbed our pollution, and buried our dead. Now, it was full. It was vomiting us out. The wind, the famous wind of my city, became a solid wall. It did not blow, it struck. I saw it hit a glass building, and the windows did not just break, they turned to dust. The air pressure was so intense, it forced people to the ground. pinning them against the earth that despised them. As a prosecutor, I understood the concept of hostile witnesses, but I had never considered that the creation itself was keeping a record of wrongs. Every drop of rain, every grain of sand, every gust of wind had been a witness to our crimes. We thought we owned the earth. We thought we could drill it, pave it, and burn it without consequence. But the lease had expired. I saw the trees in Grant Park uproot themselves. They did not fall over. They pulled their roots out of the soil like a man pulling his feet out of mud. They refused to provide shade or oxygen any longer. The covenant between man and nature was broken. The noise of the boiling lake and the crushing wind was deafening, a cacophony of judgment. It was the sound of a verdict being read without words. Guilty. We were all guilty. The arrogance of the human race, the belief that we were the masters of our environment, was being dismantled in seconds. I stood there, a spirit unaffected by the wind, but crushed by the realization. I had spent my life upholding the laws of the state, but I had ignored the laws of the universe. I had prosecuted men for stealing money, but I had never prosecuted myself for stealing the glory that belonged to the Creator. The scene began to darken. The boiling water of the lake turned into a whirlpool, a black vortex that spun faster and faster. The sky above collapsed, folding in on itself like a heavy curtain dropping at the end of a play. The ground beneath me, which I was not touching but hovering over, suddenly opened. It was not a crack. It was a mouth. I fell. The sensation of falling was not like a dream. It was heavy. It felt like I was being pulled down by the specific weight of my own sins. The wind screamed past me, but now it carried voices, millions of them. The trial of the earth was over. My personal sentencing was about to begin. The fall did not end with a crash. It ended with a click. It was the sound of a heavy latch locking into place. I opened my spiritual eyes and found myself standing on a floor of cold, polished steel that stretched out in every direction, vanishing into a grey fog. I was not in a pit of fire. I was in a canyon of metal. Towering on either side of me, rising hundreds of feet into the gloomy air, were filing cabinets. They were stacked like skyscrapers, an endless rusting metropolis of bureaucracy. This was the archives of the damned. As a prosecutor, I had spent my life building cases. I lived in a world of manila folders, red-welled envelopes, and bankers' boxes. I worshipped the paper trail. Now I was standing in the center of the ultimate paper trail. The silence here was different. It was expectant. It was the silence of a library, where sound is forbidden because the knowledge contained within is too heavy to be spoken aloud. I began to walk down the central aisle of this metallic canyon. The air smelled of stale ink and old dust, the smell of forgotten crimes. I looked at the labels on the drawers as I passed. They were not organized by date or case number. They were organized by the nature of the heart. One entire block, the size of a city block, was labeled omissions. Another was labeled justifications. I walked for what felt like miles, driven by a terrible compulsion to find my own record. In the legal world, the discovery phase is when the prosecution and defense exchange evidence. It is a time of laying cards on the table. But here, there was no defense attorney. There was only the evidence. I turned a corner and found a solitary bank of cabinets that stood apart from the rest. It was made of a darker metal, almost black, absorbing the dim light. On the front of the top drawer, etched in brass that was tarnished green, was my name, Marcus. Beneath my name was the case title, The Kingdom of God versus Marcus. My hands were trembling. In life, I had never feared opening a file. I was always the one who knew what was inside. I was the one who used the contents to destroy others. But now, I was the defendant. I reached out. The metal was freezing, burning my fingertips with cold. I pulled the handle. I expected to see paper. I expected to see transcripts of my trials, bank statements, perhaps photos of the people I had wronged. I was prepared to argue against documents. I was prepared to find loopholes in the text. But the drawer was not full of paper. It was full of movement. Thousands of black beetles poured out of the drawer the moment it opened. They spilled over the metal lip like a dark liquid, flowing down the front of the cabinet and onto my feet. They were not chaos. They were a hive. They swarmed up my legs, moving with a terrifying intelligence. I tried to brush them off, but my hands passed through them as if they were smoke, yet I could feel their legs pricking my spirit like needles. They swarmed my chest, my neck, and covered my face. And then they began to speak. These were not insects, they were my lies. Every beetle was a specific lie I had told in my 95 years of life. I heard the voice of a beetle on my shoulder, whispering in my own ear, "He is guilty, Your Honor. The evidence is irrefutable." I remembered that lie. I had said it in 1978 to secure a conviction against a man I knew was innocent, just to keep my win record perfect. The beetle bit into my neck, injecting the venom of that memory into my soul. Another beetle crawled over my eye. "I love you, Martha." I heard my voice say it to my wife on a night when I was actually thinking about my career, about my status, about anything but her. The lie was so casual, so small, yet here it was, a living thing, blinding me. The swarm grew louder. It was a cacophony of deceit. I did what I had to do. It's just business. I am a good man. God isn't real. I realized with horror that I could not close the drawer. The evidence could not be suppressed. In the earthly courts, I could file a motion to suppress evidence. I could argue that it was obtained illegally. I could charm a jury into ignoring a fact. But here, the evidence was alive. It was self-sustaining. It did not need a lawyer to present it. It presented itself. The beetles did not just cover me. They burrowed. They crawled into my mouth, choking my screams. They filled my ears, drowning out my thoughts. They were reintegrating with me. I was being forced to consume my own deceit. I fell to the steel floor, writhing under the weight of a lifetime of fabrication. I had built a fortress of words to protect myself from the truth, and now those words were eating me alive. The horrifying truth of the archive is that nothing is ever lost. Every idle word, every false promise, every silent betrayal is stored, incubated, and kept ready for this moment. I was not being punished by a demon with a pitchfork. I was being punished by the accumulation of my own character. Suddenly, the floor beneath me dissolved. The steel plates retracted. The filing cabinets shot upward as I fell again, the swarm of beetle lies still clinging to my skin, still whispering my own perjuries into my soul. I was falling out of the archive and into the tribunal. The evidence had been presented. Now, I had to face the cross-examination. The swarm of living lies dissolved into my skin as I hit the ground. I did not land on rock or steel this time. I landed on wood, old, polished, creaking wood. I stood up, adjusting the lapels of a suit I no longer wore, and froze. I knew this smell. It was the scent of floor wax, stale coffee, and anxiety. I was in a courtroom. But it was not the Dirksen Federal Building. The proportions were wrong. The ceiling was too low, pressing down like a coffin lid. The gallery, where the public usually sits, was packed. But it was not filled with people. It was filled with shadows, vague, shifting forms that whispered and giggled. They were the spirits of every criminal I had ever sent away, mixed with the demons that had goaded them into their crimes. They were the spectators of my ruin. I looked at the bench. The judge's chair was high, carved from black obsidian, looming over the room. It was empty. There was no judge. In hell, the absence of the judge is the most terrifying presence of all. It meant there was no one to appeal to. There was no mercy seat. I looked to the defense table. It was empty. There was no one to stand beside me, no advocate, No junior partner to shuffle papers. I looked to the prosecution table. It was occupied. The man standing there turned to face me. He had my face. But it was not the face of the 95-year-old man who had died in the armchair. It was the face of Marcus at 40, ruthless, sharp, arrogant, in the prime of his career. It was the version of me that cared only about winning. He smiled, and it was the coldest thing I had ever seen. I realized the cruel joke immediately. I was the defendant, and I was also the prosecutor. "The court is now in session," my younger self announced. His voice was not a sound. It was a vibration that rattled my teeth. "The charge is idolatry of the self. The specifications are endless. How does the defendant plead?" I tried to speak. I wanted to say not guilty. I wanted to argue jurisdiction. I wanted to use every legal trick I had mastered in half a century of practice. But in this place the tongue cannot lie. The atmosphere of hell acts like a truth serum. "Guilty," I whispered. The word was ripped from my throat against my will. The gallery erupted in laughter. It was a wet, tearing sound, like meat being pulled from the bone. "Louder," the prosecutor me commanded. He walked toward me, pacing the floor, just as I used to do to intimidate witnesses. "Tell the court about the bribery case in 1982, the one where you suppressed the evidence that would have cleared the young father. You wanted the conviction stats for your run at the Attorney General's office. Speak." I made a mistake," I stammered. I tried to frame it as an error, a lapse in judgment. From the shadows near the empty judge's bench, a figure stepped forward. It was a demon, massive and hunched, wearing the tattered remains of a bailiff's uniform. In its hand, it held a gavel, but it was not made of wood. It was made of human bone, a femur, polished and yellowed. The demon did not strike a sounding block. It swung the bone gavel and struck me directly in the center of my chest. The pain was beyond physical. It was not just the breaking of ribs, it was the shattering of my self-image. The blow knocked the wind out of my spirit. I fell to my knees, gasping, but there was no air to breathe. "Objection overruled," the prosecutor me sneered. "No excuses in this court. State the truth." The bailiff raised the bone gavel again, waiting. I looked up at my own face, twisted in hate. I realized I had to say it. I had to confess the raw, ugly reality without the polish of legal language. "I buried the evidence," I choked out. "I knew he was innocent. I let him rot in prison for 20 years because I wanted the promotion. I sacrificed his life for my ambition." The bailiff lowered the gavel without striking. The truth was the only thing that stayed his hand. But the confession itself burned my tongue like acid. "And the widow?" the prosecutor me asked, leaning in close. "The one you evicted. You argued that it was just the law. You told yourself you were just doing your job. Tell the court what you really felt." I tried to resist. I tried to close my mouth. But the pressure built inside my head, a massive hydraulic force pushing the words out. "I enjoyed it," I screamed. "I enjoyed the power. I liked seeing her beg. It made me feel like a god." The gallery shrieked with delight. They applauded. The applause sounded like hundreds of hands slapping wet clay. This was the torture. It was not fire yet. It was the stripping away of every layer of justification I had ever worn. For 95 years, I had told myself a story about who I was. I was a guardian of the law. I was a pillar of the community. Here, underneath the earth, that story was being dismantled sentence by sentence. The prosecutor me was relentless. He pulled files from the air, cases involving my children, my late wife, my colleagues. He forced me to admit my neglect, my adultery, my coldness. He forced me to admit that I had loved my win record more than I had loved my own family. "I object!" I finally screamed, breaking protocol. "I demand a recess. I demand to see the judge." The room went instantly silent. The laughter stopped. The prosecutor stopped pacing. He looked at me with a look of mock pity. "The judge," he whispered. "You spent 95 years ignoring the judge. You spent a lifetime telling the world that his laws were irrelevant compared to yours. You filed a motion for dismissal against God every single day of your life. And now you want him?" He turned to the bailiff. "The defendant is in contempt. Remove him." The bailiff stepped forward. He did not use the gavel this time. He grabbed me by the throat with a hand that felt like a heated iron clamp. He lifted me off the floor as if I were made of straw. The courtroom began to dissolve. The walls fell away. The floor dropped out. The prosecutor watched me go, his face impassive, marking the final victory of my guilt over my soul. "Case closed," he said. I was thrown backward, out of the courtroom, into a place where there were no words, no arguments, and no audiences. I was heading for the solitary confinement. The noise of the demons faded, replaced by a silence that was far, far worse. The courtroom did not fade away. It was simply deleted. One moment I was in the grip of the bailiff, and the next I was nowhere. I had been thrown into the solitary confinement of the damned. In the federal prison system, solitary confinement is considered the harshest punishment allowed by law. We call it the hole. Men go into it sane and come out broken. They beg for the sound of a guard's footsteps. They scream just to hear their own echo. But what I experienced was not a concrete cell. It was a vast, suffocating void of absolute nothingness. There were no walls to touch. There was no floor to pace. I was suspended in a medium that was thicker than air but thinner than water. It was pitch black. Not the darkness of a room with the lights off, but a heavy, active darkness that pressed against my eyes. It felt as though the dark was trying to enter my pores to replace the space where my soul used to be. I waited. I waited for the fire. I waited for the demons with pitchforks. I waited for the physical torture I had read about in Dante's Inferno. But nothing came. And that was the torture. I began to understand the true nature of hell. Hell is not primarily a place of external inflicting. It is a place of total subtraction. God is the source of all connection. He is the author of light, sound, texture, and time. When you are removed from his presence, those things simply cease to exist. I was alone. I tried to move my hand in front of my face. I could not see it. I could feel the movement, but there was no visual confirmation that I existed. I reached out to find a boundary, something to push against. I swam through the darkness, thrashing, clawing, desperate for a sensation. I would have welcomed a blade or a whip just to feel something other than this crushing emptiness. "Is anyone there?" I shouted. There was no echo. My voice did not travel. The sound died the instant it left my lips, absorbed by the void. It was like shouting into a vacuum. Panic set in, a primal animalistic terror. I was a man who defined himself by his relationships to power and people. I was a prosecutor. I needed a judge. I needed a jury. I needed a defendant. Without them, who was I? I was nothing. I was a consciousness trapped in a jar of infinite night. I tried to revert to my training. I tried to formulate a legal argument. I convinced myself that this was a mistake, a procedural error in the afterlife. I needed to speak to the warden. I needed to file a grievance. "I demand due process," I screamed into the blackness. "I have rights. You cannot hold me without a hearing." As I spoke the words, a horrific transformation took place in my mouth. The words did not come out as air. They turned into a physical substance. They crumbled on my tongue. Sand. My mouth filled with dry, coarse sand. I gagged, trying to spit it out, but the more I tried to argue, the more sand filled my throat. I clawed at my tongue, scraping out handfuls of grit. It was the ash of my own empty arguments. I realized then that in this place, lies and legalisms have no substance. They simply dry up and choke you. I was drowning in the dust of my own vocabulary. I stopped trying to speak. The silence returned, heavier than before. Then the cold began. It was not the winter chill of Chicago. It was the temperature of absolute isolation. It started in my extremities and moved inward. It felt like my spirit was suffering frostbite. It was a burning cold, a black fire that consumed heat without producing light. I curled into a fetal position, floating in the dark. I realized that this was the final verdict. This was the sentence I had earned. I had spent 95 years pushing God away. I had told him I didn't need him. I had told him I was the master of my own fate. And now he had granted my wish. He had fully withdrawn. I am alone, I thought. The thought echoed in my mind with the force of a thunderclap. I am alone forever. The concept of forever crashed down on me. In prison, a life sentence has an end. Death is the release. But here, death had already happened. There was no release. There was no appeal. There was only this moment, stretching out into an infinite line of identical moments of silence and cold. I thought of my wife. I thought of the time she had asked me to go to church with her, and I had laughed, calling it a crutch for the weak. I realized now that she was not weak. She was connected to the source. She was anchored. I was the one who was adrift. The weight of the darkness became physical. It felt like the pressure of the ocean depth. It squeezed my chest, compressing my spirit until I felt I would implode. I wanted to cease existing. I wanted to be annihilated. But the soul cannot die. It can only suffer. I was a speck of dust floating in a universe of regret. I had prosecuted thousands of men, but I had never understood that the worst prison is not one made of bars. The worst prison is to be locked inside yourself, with the door to God welded shut. I began to weep, but even my tears felt different. They were not wet. They burned like acid on my cheeks, scarring my face. I was weeping acid, choking on sand, freezing in the dark. God, I whimpered. It wasn't an argument, it wasn't a demand. It was a broken, terrified whisper. Help me. It was the first honest thing I had said in 50 years, and because it was honest, it did not turn to sand. The silence of the void was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered not just sound, but hope. I was floating in the aftermath of my own broken plea, the taste of sand still gritty in my mouth. I had whispered, "Help me," but I expected nothing. Why should I? I had spent a century denying the very existence of the one I was now calling upon. By my own legal standards, I had no standing. I had no precedent. I was out of time, but the laws of heaven are not the laws of Illinois. In the crushing darkness above me, a pinprick appeared. At first I thought it was a hallucination, a firing synapse in a dying consciousness, but it grew. It wasn't a sun, and it wasn't a star. It was a rectangle of luminescence, fluttering down through the endless night like a leaf falling from a tree. It was a piece of paper. I watched it descend, mesmerized. In the world of total blackness, this small sheet of white was blinding. It swirled in the non-existent air, drifting closer to where I huddled. As it got closer, I recognized the shape. I knew the dimensions. It was legal-sized bond paper. It looked exactly like the thousands of motions and briefs I had filed in my career. It floated within reach. My hands were numb from the cold of the void, shaking uncontrollably. But I reached out. I had to know. Was this my sentence? Was this the final order confirming my damnation? My fingers brushed the edge of the paper. Immediately, a shockwave of heat traveled up my arm. It wasn't the freezing burn of the void. It was a living heat. It hurt, but it was the pain of blood returning to a limb that has been asleep for too long. I grabbed it. I brought it close to my face, squinting against the glow. It was a handwritten letter. The handwriting was rough, scrawled in pencil, the kind used by inmates who aren't allowed pens. The header didn't say United States District Court. It simply said, "To the Supreme Judge." And then I heard the voice. It didn't come from my ears. It resonated directly inside my chest, vibrating against my ribs. It was a man's voice, hoarse, broken, weeping. Lord, I know he's a hard man. I know he put me here for life. I know he didn't care about the truth, only the win. But Lord, don't let him die like this. I forgive him. I release him. Show him the mercy he didn't show me. I froze. I knew that voice. It belonged to a man named Tyrell. I had prosecuted him 20 years ago for a racketeering charge. He was guilty, yes, but I had stacked the charges, twisting the law to ensure he would never see daylight again, just to make a headline in the Chicago Tribune. I had destroyed him with a smile on my face. And now, from a concrete cell in a maximum security prison in downstate Illinois, Tyrell was praying for me. The irony hit me harder than the demon's gavel. I was the wealthy, powerful prosecutor who lived in a penthouse. He was a convict with nothing but a Bible and a pencil. Yet in the spiritual realm, our positions were reversed. He was the free man, holding the ear of the king. I was the prisoner, shackled by my own pride. The paper in my hands began to glow brighter. The light wasn't just illumination, it was a solvent. I looked at my hands, my spectral hands that were covered in the grey grime of my sins, the stains left by the beetles and the sand. Where the light of the prayer touched my skin, the filth hissed and evaporated. The prayer of a righteous man, even a man in prison, was cutting through the darkness of my hell. I tried to read the rest of the letter, but the words were dissolving into pure light. The document was a motion for pardon, filed not by a high-priced attorney, but by a victim of my own ruthless ambition. Tyrell was interceding for his executioner. "Why?" I sobbed. The sand was gone from my throat. My voice returned, no longer choking me. "Why would you pray for me?" The answer came not in words, but in a sudden upward pull. The paper dissolved into a rope of light, wrapping around my wrist. It was a lifeline. The darkness of the void reacted violently. The shadows surged, trying to grab my legs, trying to pull me back down into the cold. I felt the heavy, wet grip of the demons trying to reclaim their property. They screamed, a sound like tearing metal, furious that a soul was slipping through their fingers on a technicality they could not defeat. Grace, I held onto the wrist of light with everything I had. I didn't deserve it. That was the point. Justice would have left me in the dark. Mercy was pulling me out. I was yanked upward at impossible speed. The archives, the courtroom, the city of smoke and bone, they all blurred into a streak of grey as I shot back toward the surface. The cold fire of hell fell away, replaced by the stinging physical cold of a Chicago winter. I was returning, but I was not coming back as the same man. The Marcus who had died in that chair was gone. The man returning was a witness to a trial he had never prepared for. The transition was violent. It was not a gentle awakening. It was a collision. I slammed back into my body with the force of a car crash. The silence of the void was instantly shattered by a cacophony of earthly noise, the beep of machinery, the static of a radio, and the shouting of voices. "Clear!" My chest heaved upward, arching off the floor. I felt a massive electrical jolt rip through my ribs, restarting the engine that had stalled. Air rushed into my lungs, burning like fire. I coughed, a wet hacking sound that sprayed saliva and bile onto my silk tie. I was lying on the Persian rug in my study. The room was crowded. Paramedics were kneeling over me, their faces tight with focus. My housekeeper was standing in the doorway, her hands covering her mouth, weeping. The spilled coffee was still soaking into the papers on the floor. I had been gone for eternity, yet in this room only minutes had passed. "We've got a pulse," one of the medics said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "He's back, shallow, but he's back." I tried to sit up. I wanted to tell them what I had seen. I wanted to grab the medic by the collar and scream that the city outside was a prison yard, that the filing cabinets were waiting, that the insects were real. Objection, I tried to say, but the word didn't come out. My tongue felt heavy, swollen, foreign in my mouth. All that escaped my lips was a guttural groan. The eloquence I had prided myself on for 95 years was gone. The man who could captivate a jury with a whisper could now barely form a syllable. God had humbled my speech so that I might finally learn to listen. They loaded me onto a stretcher. As they wheeled me out of the penthouse, the movement was jarring. We passed the large bay window where I had first seen the spiritual infrastructure of Chicago. I looked out. The chains were gone from my physical sight. The demons of legalism and the spirits of distraction were no longer visible to my naked eye. The city looked normal. Lights twinkling, snow falling gently. But I knew what was crawling underneath the skin of the world. The ignorance was gone. I could feel the weight of the city's sin pressing against the glass. In the ambulance, the lights were too bright. I closed my eyes, and instantly I saw the face of the prosecutor, me, the younger, ruthless version of myself. He was still there in the back of my mind, waiting, but he was silent now. He had been overruled. I spent 3 weeks in the ICU. The doctors called it a miraculous recovery for a man of my age. They talked about ejection fractions and neurological responses. They praised the speed of the emergency response. I didn't tell them about Tyrell. As soon as I regained the ability to hold a pen, I didn't reach for my case files. I didn't reach for my awards. I asked for a specific pad of paper. My hand shook, a tremor that would never leave me, but I wrote a letter. It wasn't to a judge, it wasn't to a client. It was to the warden of the downstate correctional facility. I hired a new lawyer, not a corporate shark, but a young woman from a legal aid clinic. I gave her one instruction: get Tyrell out, use my own files to prove I misconducted the trial, destroy my reputation if you have to, just get him out. It took 6 months. When Tyrell walked free, I was too frail to go and meet him. I watched it on the news from my wheelchair. He didn't look angry. He looked at the camera and said, "God is the only judge." He was right. I am 96 now. My days in the courtroom are over. I sit by the window, but I don't look at the skyline with pride anymore. I look at it with a watchman's fear. I know that the docket is full. I know that the archive is open. And I know that every single person walking on those streets is one heartbeat away from the discovery phase. I was given a stay of execution, not because I was innocent, but because a man I tried to destroy chose to intercede for me. That is the only reason I am writing this. You are the jury now. You have heard the testimony. You have seen the evidence. The court of this world is a sham. The real trial is coming, and you cannot win it on your own. You need an advocate. You need the one who has already served the sentence for you. Do not wait for the gavel to fall.